Welcome to this presentation on a liberal democracy and a populist challenge. My name is Dr. Marcel Lewandowski. I'm a visiting assistant professor via the German Academic Exchange Service at the Center for European Studies here at the University of Florida. Before we talk about the causes and consequences of populist party success, not only on the radical right, but also on the radical left and even in the political center, we will have a look at the relevance of this topic first. So as you can see, the average share of votes for populist parties in Europe has increased over time since the 1980s. So in the 1980s, it was roughly a little more than 10%. In 2016, more than 90% of the vote in Europe go to populist parties. Now, if we look at the average vote share of populist radical rights parties in specific, you see an even stronger effect. So in 1980, not even 2% of the voters supported populist radical right parties. And now in 2016-17, it's almost 14%. That means a great deal of voters in Europe is supporting parties that are on the one hand, positioning themselves at the against the political establishment, and on the other hand, they promote restrictive immigration policies. Now, we have to understand a little more what populism actually is, because from this understanding, we can construct possible consequences for a liberal democracy, because at the core of this presentation is the question, why and to what extent is the electoral success of populist parties a danger to liberal democracy as we know it? Now, the first question we have to ask is, what is populism? Now, a lot of people use this term, right? In everyday political discussions, we tend to say something is populist if we think that the politician who proposes something is not serious about it, is only saying something to gain votes and so on. But actually, there's a substance to populism. And I'll talk about this first. So this looks pretty straightforward. Populism, according to many researchers in political science, is actually a two-dimensional concept, which means that it consists of two things that have to be present. So both of these things that I'm going to name in a second have to be present in order for us to talk about populism. So on the one hand, a party, a politician, even just a political statement has to claim that there is such a thing as a politically homogeneous people. There might be ciphers to address these people, such as the common man, the hardworking man, the human farmer, and so on. So everything that the populist claims to represent the people as a whole and to embody the political will of these people. So that reference to that people as a homogeneous body has to be in there. This has to be combined, secondly, with a reference or an appeal against the elites. So it has to embrace a form of anti-elitism. And the elites, on the other hand, are also perceived as a homogeneous group. So the elites are perceived or portrayed as corrupt, incompetent. Bottom line being, they're not interested in what they should do according to the populace, and that is directly executing the will of the people. So populism is about saying there is a homogeneous people, they have a common will, and politics is all about executing the sovereignty of the people. But at the same time, populists claim the political elites that are in place are not doing that. Whether we speak of left and right populism depends on the so-called host ideology that populism attaches to. So left populism, for example, embraces such things as equality, economic redistribution. The outsider it defines are the rich and wealthy, but also, as with all populist movements, left-wing populism is directed against those up there, so to say, so the political elites. For right-wing populists, it's not only about the people versus the elites, it's also about us, the people, as a culturally homogeneous body against aliens especially in Europe, refugees, Muslims, any forms of minorities, and so on. So this is the basic difference between left-wing and right-wing populism. What they have in common is the reference to the people as a homogeneous body and the portrayal of the political elites as being opposed to the people and self-interested. Now, actually, we have to ask three questions as a consequence of that. How substantial is the demand for populism? How does populism then affect democracy? And are there successful counter strategies against populism? Let's begin with the first question. Before we do that, however, I just would like to show you two plots here, which is about understanding that populism is not attached to one specific ideology only. I said that before, there's left-wing, there's right-wing populism. We normally understand political systems, party systems, as being divided by two super issues, which is economic left and right. Left is state-oriented, right is market-oriented economies, and progressive conservative societal values. Now, if we look at the two dimensions here, we see that not only are parties, but also are populist parties all over the place. So you see very conservative, that is right-wing populist parties, such as the FN, Front National, no, Rassemblement National, National Rally in France, ANEL, that is the populist radical right party in Greece, or the German AfD. You also see in Western Europe, at the bottom of this graph, of the left graph, left-wing populist parties. So, such as the Movimento Cinque Stelle in Italy, which is actually a little more centrist than left-wing. The party The Left in Germany, that is the DL, that you see depicted here, and Syriza in Greece. In Central and Eastern Europe, on the other hand, most populist parties are to be found in the more conservative part of the political spectrum. So at the political right in that sense, because whether we speak of left and right is not referring to their economic position, it's referring to their position on the societal super issue, progressive conservative. Progressive means left, conservative means right. So what you see here is that parties such as the PIS in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary, Jobbik in Hungary as well, they're all populist parties in that sense, and they're all to be found at the conservative spectrum, the right-wing spectrum of political parties. In contrast to Western Europe, where we also find relevant populist left parties. Now, considering the question of whether there is such a connection between populism and support or attacks against liberal democracy, we only have to look at the shape that these little scatters here take in the two plots that I've just shown you. So in both plots, we actually see that there is more or less a line that you can draw between all these dots here. And that means that there is a correlation between the question if whether populist parties or parties in general support or do not support liberal democratic norms. So the less supportive they are, the more to the right they are on this scale, and the degree to which populism is important for their rhetoric. This is what the y-axis says with populist saliency. And what you can see here is, since you can draw almost a straight line, that means that the more populism plays a role for the overall profile of a political party, the less it supports liberal democratic norms. And you can see actually that populism, the more populist a party is, the less it is supportive of what we call liberal democracy. And this has certain consequences. Now, why do people actually vote for these parties? Some say that voters of populist parties are actually protest voters. Others say that it's more substantial, it has to do with the ideology of these parties. So what is true? What is true? What we see in this graph here by Matthijs Rodin, you see the citation at the bottom here, if you're interested in looking it up. What you see here actually is that the common denominator of populist parties, left and right, in terms of who supports them and why, is political distrust. So political distrust leads to a higher likelihood of people voting populist parties in their country. Could be left-wing populist parties, can be right-wing populist parties. However, you also see that when it comes to other aspects, such as class, the income of individuals, the employment status of voters, their education, and so on, you hardly see any common ground between all these parties that would unite all these different parties, both populist left and populist right and other populist parties. So when it comes, however, to populist radical right voters, one important aspect comes to mind as well, and that is a negative overall attitude towards immigration. So in a nutshell, we can say support for populist parties in general has to do with political distrust. Support for populist radical right parties in specific has to do with political distrust on the one hand, and at the same time with negative attitudes towards immigration. But let's stick with the problem of populism as an attitude for one more second. Now, what other studies have found, it's not in this study, it's in other studies that I'm showing you here, is that populism is not only a phenomenon that you find on the supply side. It's not only something that political parties embrace as a rhetoric or as a political ideology. It's also an attitude. You, I, others, the people that I share the room with right now, can be populist to a greater or lesser extent with regard to whether they support the populist claims of there being such a thing as a homogeneous people and the elites being self-interested and corrupt. What you can see here on the left side is that populist attitudes, in fact, have a huge influence on voting behavior, meaning that voters of populist parties do not vote for these parties by mistake, or only because there is such a vague thing as political distrust and protest. They also share the view on democracy with these parties, that is populism. When it comes to democracy, in Germany, for example, we find that those who support the left and right populist parties, the left in Germany is a left-wing populist party, the AfD in Germany is a right-wing populist party. The supporters of these parties are also supporters of direct democracy. However, whereas left-wing populist supporters are supportive of agenda initiatives only, that means enhancing the participation of citizens, supporters of populist radical right parties, such as the AfD, are also opting for not only more participation of citizens, but also mandatory referendums at the federal level in order to control the political elites. So we see distinct patterns of what individuals demand when they vote for populist parties when it comes to democracy. So they have a certain thing in mind with regard to what do they expect from democracy. And in fact, especially populist radical right voters want not only more participation, but also more control. And that pretty much speaks to what we have found before, the high level of distrust with these voters in democracy. So what are the consequences then? And what counter strategies are out there when it comes to populism? So the consequences here, if we look at different countries such as Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Greece, Hungary, and Poland, where different forms of populist parties have been in power for a certain amount of time. In Greece, it was a left-wing populist party in a coalition with the right-wing populist party, which is pretty much a unique phenomenon. In the Czech Republic, it was a centrist populist party, and in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland are still populist radical right parties in power. What we're looking at here are so-called partial regimes of democracy, because democracy consists of different logics and institutions. And for example, one logic is, or one institution is how elections, the shape of elections, how elections take place. Is it a first past the post or a proportional representation system? What about the degree of political rights that citizens have? What about the degree of civil rights they have? The horizontal accountability of government and the effective power to rule. So horizontal accountability pretty much refers to the division of power. So the division of power is a crucial part of democracy. What we see here, you see a lot of zeros here, so concentrate on what is important. In almost every country where populists were in power, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, horizontal accountability, which is the division of power, has decreased. And that makes total sense. Populists claim that they speak for the people, they only speak for the people. So once they are in power, they conduct reforms of the political system that weakens checks and balances, such as judicial review, the power of constitutional courts, the media system, and so on. Because what populists do is they're not establishing a flat-out dictatorship, as we know from the interwar era in Germany or in Italy. What they do is they keep elections in place. You see all the zeros with the electoral regime, which means there is no change here. They keep elections in place, but they weaken the division of power because they claim, and that is actually how they justify this move. They claim that, for example, the Supreme Court or any constitutional court is occupied by elites that have no interest in executing the will of the people. And they say this is what democracy is all about. And they are the ones that speak for the people. So anything that contradicts their power contradicts the will of the people, which is why they decrease that division of powers in a democracy. So what can one do against that? Bad news is this: there's actually no one-size-fits-all strategy when it comes to how do we approach populist parties, especially the populist radical right. You see that possible counter strategies first have to acknowledge that there are different arenas in which you can approach populist parties: parliament, the media, and party competition in general. And you got formal ways of attacking, if you will, or counterattacking populist radical right parties, and you got informal ways or content-related ways of doing that. And there's a whole variety. Research has come up with a lot of case-related findings, but you actually do not find any one strategy that would fit for any case that is out there. So some, for example, in Europe say the mainstream right parties have to shift towards a more radical right position, for example, when it comes to immigration, because then they would reattract voters. That is not necessarily the case. What might happen is that if parties do that, they increase the legitimacy of the populist radical right parties, because then they can claim, see, we're not even in power, and those up there, the elites, they're doing what we want. So there's not that one strategy that would lead to an increase of the electoral power of populist radical right parties. Several parties in several countries have come up with different solutions. But at the end of the day, for the time being, we are living with strong populist and populist radical right parties in specific in European countries. And especially when it comes to Hungary and Poland, we see that they're affecting democracy in a negative way. Thank you so much for your attendance.